Hi everybody, as Jesslyn said, I am April Ingle and I'm the Executive Director at Georgia River Network, and it's so nice to see all of your smiling faces out there. And I know a lot of you have not ever come to Weekend for Rivers or our annual conference before, and we're so happy that you're here today and decided to come to Weekend for Rivers this year. And I know a lot of you probably know Georgia River Network primarily through Paddle Georgia. Raise your hands just out of curiosity. Who in the room has been on Paddle Georgia at least once? Yay, a lot of our Paddle Georgia friends are here. And so, well, hopefully my stories will be a little bit of a trip down memory lane for those of you who have had the opportunity to go on Paddle Georgia, and also maybe entice some of you who have not been on Paddle Georgia before to come and experience it with us sometime. So, as we get ready to launch the 8th annual Paddle Georgia this summer on the Ohoopee and the Altamaha rivers, it's got me thinking about all that I've learned from Paddle Georgia all these years. It occurs to me that Paddle Georgia has offered me some pretty good life lessons, and perhaps they'll be useful to you too. 8 years ago, Joe Cook, who at the time I had only met once before, came to Athens for a small Georgia River Network event that we were putting on for Earth Day to give his slideshow about a 30-day trip he, Monica, and a 3-year-old Ramsey took on the Etowah from its source in the North Georgia mountains to Rome. After the event, Joe and I went to dinner at the Grit, and over PBRs, Joe pitched an idea to me. He told me that after his presentation that night, as would often happen to Joe after he gave one of his slideshows, that people came up to him at the end and asked, "I would love to be able to go on a long-distance paddling trip like that someday, but I'm stumped how to pull it off." This question, asked of him over and over, had Joe thinking for a while. It is indeed a feat for individuals to pull off a long-distance river trip all by themselves. But what if someone, in fact, if he were to organize a long-distance river trip and all the logistics and invite whoever was up for the adventure to come along? It would be modeled after the bicycle ride across Georgia, but instead of traveling roads by bikes, we would travel the state of Georgia by river in canoes and kayaks. He just needed an organization to partner with. At the time, Georgia River Network was just staffed by Dana and myself. So I said I would talk to Dana, we all discussed it, and said, sure, sounds like fun, let's do it. So lesson number 1. When someone presents you with an opportunity, even when it's coming from a guy with a ponytail that you barely know, over PBRs, always think of saying yes before you say no. Now, I would be a liar if I didn't admit that I've questioned that decision numerous times since that fateful day. But I would also be a liar if I didn't admit that for all the hardships, and even a few shed tears, that it is totally worth it. So lesson number 2, when faced with hardship, ask yourself, is it worth it? If it is, carry on. And speaking of tears, I doubt it would be fair to compare all men to Joe Cook. But lesson number 3 I learned, if not about all men, at least about Joe, that nothing leaves a man more flummoxed than a woman in tears. I figured out that one day on Paddle Georgia when I went to Joe bawling after I had been chewed out and raked over the coals by a very large, very unpleasant man. Joe's response, it'll be okay, go have a smoothie. So, lesson number 3 according to Joe, life lesson number 3 according to Joe, when life gives you lemons, go have a smoothie. It will make everything better. Seriously, some of the best parts of my job are the scouting trips that Joe and I have been on to scout each year's route on Paddle Georgia. I've had the chance to paddle over 700 miles on 7 different Georgia rivers and camp on countless sandbars on these trips alone. I feel very lucky to count Joe as one of my dear friends, and I have that because of Paddle Georgia too. Now, when we started planning the first Paddle Georgia, we had our fair share of people who thought we were crazy, and advisors who advised us against doing it, basically telling us that we were wasting our time and that this was a poor use of our time and resources. We pushed on, however, thinking we would be very happy if 100 people wanted to join us on that first adventure. You can imagine our delight and terror when 300 people signed up. There were hundreds of lessons in event planning and organizing and volunteer management and logistics. I could go on and on that we learned that first year. And let me tell you, it would be an understatement to say it was an exercise in endurance. It still is. Once the final boat was loaded and the last paddler left the parking lot that last day of Paddle, Georgia 2005, it was just Joe, Dana, and I standing there. The three of us just looked at each other with stunned expressions, and someone said, "I can't believe we just pulled that off." Then all three of us busted into hysterical laughter. Folks, we had no idea what we were doing. And the fact that we pulled it off and people truly had a great time felt like nothing short of a miracle. When Joe shared, right at that moment then, Joe shared a quote by Mark Twain that I'll offer as lesson number 3. All you need is ignorance and confidence, and success is sure to follow. We may learn our lessons the hard way, but we do learn from them. It got easier after that first year. Well, I take that back. It got easier after the second year. We learned what worked and what didn't. We got lots of help from a band of incredible volunteers and interns, and our staff has grown since those first years. Now, some of you who know me may find this hard to believe, but that first year, one of the hardest things for me was how very bossy I had to be. I just wasn't comfortable with it. But I had no choice. There were 300 people who knew even less than I did, and I had to tell people what to do, sometimes at the top of my lungs. I mentioned this to one of the paddlers who I didn't know at all at the time, but later would become a dear friend, and he laid the foundation for another life lesson. He said, "You know, people park their cars in parking lots every day of their lives. But do you know what would happen on Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, if no one had painted any lines in the mall parking lot?" So lesson number 5, somebody has to paint the lines. I also worried over what we lovingly refer to as feedback. Helpful suggestions, good advice, complaints, red-faced temper tantrums, and disappointment. I confided these worries to a longtime mentor of mine who worked a long time for Outward Bound and led countless trips, and he offered what turned out for me to be revolutionary advice. He told me that you have to set people's expectations. You have to clearly let them know what to expect when they sign up for Paddle Georgia. He also told me that we could do everything perfectly without a single flaw, but if someone is expecting something different than what we delivered, even if it's perfect and flawless, they'll still be disappointed. So lesson number 5, if people know what to expect, they will rarely be disappointed. Now, some of you may remember Jan Kearse, who worked for Georgia River Network several years ago now. She's another Outward Bound veteran. She also offered me some revolutionary advice about how to help people on Paddle Georgia. She said Outward Bound teaches their new students to expect to be uncomfortable as they voyage outside of their comfort zone. That the discomfort is to be expected, but that it'll dissipate as they become acclimated to their new normal. The discomfort won't last. Just be patient with yourself and the experience while you adjust. They don't call it the comfort zone for nothing. There are all kinds of reasons we choose, or we should choose, to go beyond our comfort zone. And let's face it, sometimes life forces us or just plain pushes us out of our comfort zone without our permission. When faced with hardships or discomfort, I try to remember lesson number 6 from Paddle Georgia. Be patient with yourself and the experience and with others while you adjust to being out of your comfort zone. Finally, I'm going to wrap up with something I learned from a former president, Jimmy Carter. When President Carter came to our Paddle Georgia, actually, can you forward to like the Jimmy Carter pictures? That kind of got behind. There you go. Thank you. So I'm going to wrap up with something I learned from Jimmy Carter. When President Carter came to our Paddle Georgia 2008 fish fry to celebrate the end of our adventure on the Flint River and the start of a new Flint River keeper, it was truly one of the best days of my life, the kind you don't forget. For several years, Mother Nature had a tradition on the last day of Paddle Georgia to let loose a rip-roaring thunderstorm right around 6 p.m. on the last day of Paddle Georgia, right when our fish fry is about to begin. In 2008, she didn't disappoint. Right as President Carter's van pulled into the parking lot, the skies let loose. Glenn Dowling and I walked over to the van to greet the president, and as he got out of the van, a Secret Service agent handed him an umbrella. Me, on the other hand, I hadn't thought of an umbrella or a rain jacket or anything. I was just standing in the rain. It worked out in my favor, though. As the president and I took off walking together to greet all the other folks at the event, he said to me, "Why don't you get under the umbrella with me? I don't want to look like I'm not a gentleman." So I got to walk under an umbrella in the rain with Jimmy. So lesson number 7, sometimes things work out better when you don't have all your bases covered. That night, President Carter talked to us about paddling and his connection to rivers and how it grew his efforts to protect the Flint River, and how it grew into his efforts to protect the Flint River as Georgia governor and many more rivers as president of the United States. As president, he eliminated several planned dam projects across the country. He told us that night that of all the issues that he took on as president, many of which, as you know, were highly controversial, saving rivers was by far the most controversial thing he did as president. So the final lesson I learned from Paddle Georgia is this: without question, saving rivers is hard work. When I grow impatient or tired or disappointed or uncomfortable or frustrated in the work to save rivers, I try to remember that it's hard work, and that without question, it is worth it. Thank you.